Okay, so in this video we're going to look at doing task 1. So task 1 is setting everything up, and it is fairly straightforward. We're just basically entering the data on the tutor group, and then we're going to allow all the candidates to all the students to vote for the candidates, and we have to enter the candidate names as well, and then work out who's won at the end. So I'm going to be using Python idle throughout this, but if you're using a different IDE, that's absolutely fine. Okay, so task 1, setting up the voting system to allow a tutor group to elect a representative. First thing we're going to do is allow the tutor to enter the name of the tutor group. Now we have to check their entry because there is some stipulation as to what that would be. So we have something like 7A, 7B, etc. So what we need to do is, other than just obviously get the user to input that, we need to check it as well. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create the code to store the class name. And we're going to use that and just have that as blank for the moment, because obviously it's going to be something like 7A or 7B, etc. So if we ask the user to input each section of that, so the number part and then the letter part, that will make our lives a lot easier, because what we can do is we can get them to enter the first part, like the number for the 7, for example, and then the letter, which might be C, and then what we can do is concatenate those strings. We can add those strings together and basically get the 7C. But because we are originally getting them in separately, then we can analyse those things separately and not have to worry about splitting them out. So let's do the first bit. Let's get that in. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to get the year group in, and I'm going to ask the user to input that. And actually what I'm going to do is I'm going to convert that to be an integer. It's a bit easier to work with numbers if they are number variables, so a number data type rather than a text. So I'm going to put enter the year group like that, and then I'm going to get them to enter the letter group as well separately. Now that's just going to be a string, so I'm just going to put that as enter the year letter, like that. So straightforward, nothing too complicated about that, but we do get to the point now that we need to analyse what they've entered, and we need to check that they've entered something correctly. So we could just have an if statement and check it that way. So let's do that first. Let's actually add our if statement and say, well, first of all, we need to check, have they entered a year that is 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 or 11. So I'm just going to actually add that to my text here. 7, it's not 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 and 11. So I'm going to say if the data that they entered, so if the year group that they entered is not in 7, 8, 9, 10 and 11, so this is set theory, very important in computing. So if they've not entered 7, 8, 9, 10 or 11, then we're going to produce an error. We're going to say there's been an error, you haven't entered the value that we're expecting. But what we can also do in the same if statement is add in another check and say, or the length of our letter group. So we're going to check to see how many letters they entered for our letter group. And if it's more than 1, then there's an error as well. Because if you look back at the original question here, it says there are 6 tutor groups and it's followed by a single letter. So they are heavily indicating here that you need to enter 1 letter, and they want you to check the data entry for that specifically. They haven't actually officially said kind of what letter it needs to be, so I'm not going to check anything else. But if you want to, what you can do is you can add further checks in as well, so that they enter, you know, A, B, C, D, E, or down to Z, and they haven't entered an asterisk or a bracket or something like that. But I'm just going to stick to the sort of bare minimum in these videos, so that if you want to embellish any of this, and it actually, if you look at what I've done and you look at it and you think, actually, I wouldn't do it that way, I'll do it slightly differently, you go right ahead. It's very important that you make this your own, and I'm just showing you the bare minimum. Okay, so I'm just going to put a colon at the end of that. So what we're doing is we're checking to see if they've done something wrong. That's effectively what we're doing. And if they have, then we're going to say print the year group, sorry, open quotes there, the year group should be 7 to 11, and the letter group 1 character. Now, if you want to change that error message, you go right ahead. It's probably not the best error message ever, but you get the idea. Okay, so if they enter something correctly, if they enter something like 7D or 7B or whatever it is, then what we need to do is we need to create our class name. We can concatenate those two things that they enter together, the year group and the letter group, and create our class name. So we can just set our class name equal to our year group, but we have to turn that into a string. And then we add on the letter group, and that's already a string, so that's fine. So effectively what we're doing is we're saying take the year group, for example 7, make it a string like this, a 7, and then we're concatenating them together. So if it's D or something like that, it would be D in quotes, and the answer of what we get finally would be 7D, because if we add two strings together, it just pushes them together to make a new string with them both next to each other. Actually, that would be in quotes as well. I can't type, there we go, like that. That's effectively what we're doing. Okay, so I'm going to just let you pause, just pause there, let you just add that in and make sure that it's working correctly, and I'm going to run this. Okay, so I've saved my code and I'm running this. I've just noticed I've left off the bracket in my string there, but I'll change that in a moment. So I'm just going to enter something correct. So I'll just put 7 and then H, for example, and that's not produced any errors, so that's fine. So then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to add that bracket, end bracket on there in my text. Now I'm going to enter something that's incorrect. So I'm going to run it again. Let's click on the right thing first. There we go. And enter something incorrectly. So I'm going to enter, for example, 12. And then I'll enter 3 digits here, and I've got an error. It says year group should be 7 to 11 and letter group 1 character. So the basis of my validation check is there, but you might notice that there is a bit of a problem here, because if they do enter something incorrectly, actually what we need to do is we need to get them to enter the data again. So a good way to do this is to add this whole chunk of code that we've just written into a while loop. And by adding it into a while loop, we can force the user to keep re-entering the data until they enter it into a format that we want them to, and they match all the rules that we want them to. So that's what we're going to do next. We're going to add in a while loop around this. Now, our while loop is going to be controlled by a Boolean variable. Boolean variables are great with while loops. So the first thing we need to do is to create the Boolean variable that is going to control this. And I'm going to call it valid. And I'm going to, so my variable that I'm going to control it with is going to be called valid. And we're going to set it to be false. So what we're going to assume that what they enter is not valid to start with. And then I'm going to create my while loop underneath, and I'm going to say while valid double equals, so we're checking for equality, while it's false, and then a colon. So while they're not entered it incorrectly, we're going to loop around, and then I'm going to select all of the code that I've just written, and I'm going to tab it in so it's part of that while loop. You'll remember that for any code to be part of a while loop, it has to be indented underneath that while loop. So just go through that again. Okay, I selected all of my code and I pressed the tab key once. Okay, so it should look like that. All of that code is tabulated in, and it will force the user to re-enter. Now there's one little extra thing that we need to add. If they enter the correct data, not only do we create our class name here, but we also need to exit this loop. And the only way to exit this loop is if we set our control variable, our valid, equal to be true. They've entered something that we like, that we are happy with, so we set this to true and we can exit the while loop. So let's test that. So I'm going to run this again. So I've got enter the year group, and I'm going to enter something incorrect. So I'm going to enter 12, and then I'm going to enter more than one letter for that. And it says the year group should be 7 to 11 and the letter group 1 character. So it's forced me now to enter it again. So let's enter something correct, like 7F. And it's quit out, which means it's exited the while loop, and that is working correctly. So having a while loop with a control variable, a Boolean, that forces you to enter the correct data is a great way for validation checks when we're entering things. So we're going to use this structure with the next part of the pre-release. Okay, so we've done that first part of the pre-release, so we can now move on to the next thing, and the next thing is we're going to allow the tutor to enter the number of students in the tutor group. And we can see that it says there the school has between 28 and 35 students in each group. So we're going to do exactly the same thing. We're going to let the user enter the data and then we're going to check it. So actually what we can do is we can copy and paste this whole section of code and do exactly the same thing, but change it so that instead of the check is on the year group, it's on the data that we're entering for how many students there are. So the first thing I'm going to do, as I said, is I'm just going to copy and paste that whole chunk of code, and we're going to change it to have the number of students entered. So we're going to stick to having valid equal to false again, because we need to go into our new while loop. Now I'm going to remove this line here, letter group, and I'm just going to delete that fully, because we are only entering one thing. We're entering the number of students. So I'm going to create a variable just above the while loop here, and it's called numStudents or numStu, and I'm going to set that to be 0 because it needs to, obviously we don't know how many there are yet, but we'll just create it here and set it to be 0. Then I'm going to, instead of inputting the year group, I'm going to input the number of students here. And then I'm just going to change my prompt here to say enter the number of students in the class. Okay, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove this section of the check here because we're only checking for one thing, and we're going to check that the number of students is not, so it needs to be between 28 and 35. So if the number of students is less than 28, or the number of students is greater than 35, then we've got a problem. We've got an error, and this is what's called a range check. So I'm just going to put in there, that's a range check. Okay, and then we're going to prompt them to say, sorry, the number of students must be between 28 and 35. Okay, then if they enter something that is between 28 and 35, so something correct, we can exit the loop just like we did before. We don't need this line of code here, class name, because we've done that. That's just copied and pasted from the previous section. So if we just have a look at this again, we are creating a variable called the number of students, which is going to tell us how many students are going to vote. we're resetting our variable valid to be false so that we can then go into our while loop and force the user to enter a value until they enter a value between 28 and 35. Then what we're going to do is we're going to input that value, the number of students, and store it in the variable numStu. Then we're going to use our if statement to check, have they entered a number in that range between 28 and 35? If they haven't, we're going to print a message to them to say, sorry, it's not right. But if they do enter a value between 28 and 35, we're just going to set our control variable for our while loop to be true, and it will quit out of that block of code. Okay, so I'm going to just test this code now and make sure it works correctly. So you do the same, and we can't actually see what I've done there. So I'm going to enter correct data for the year group and the year letter. And here it says enter the number of students in the class. So I'm going to enter 3. So that's way too low. And it says there, number of students in the class is not correct. So it's forced me to enter that value again. So it says the number of students must be between 28 and 35. So if I now enter 99, that's a too high value. Again, it's saying, sorry, you can't proceed effectively. But if I enter 30, for example, that's a valid number, it has now exited that while loop and it's continuing on. It just happens that there's no other code yet. Okay, so that is our second check, our second entry of data, and we can move on to the third one now. So now we can move on to the next part, and it says allow the tutor to enter the number of candidates in the election, a maximum of 4 candidates. Now it doesn't say a minimum number of candidates, but if you think about it, actually we're probably going to check, make sure that there's at least 2 candidates, because if there's only 1 candidate, there's no point in holding an election because that candidate will automatically get in. And that's the case with any kind of election. But so actually what we're going to do is going to do exactly the same as those first 2 things. We're going to have the code to check to make sure that they enter a number between 2 and 4. So we can copy and paste again. And I'm just going to copy this whole section here, copy it and then paste it in. And this time, instead of number of students, it's going to be called the number of candidates, numcans. And the next 2 lines of code can be left the same, but we're going to enter the number of candidates here and enter the number of candidates in our prompt. And then here on our if statement where we're doing our range check, we're going to do a range check again, but this time it needs to be between 2 and 4 candidates. But we need to make sure we change the variable that it's checking from numStu to numcans. So do make sure you do that, because if you don't do that, then when you run it later on, you'll be entering values and thinking, why isn't it working? So the number of candidates must be between 2 and 4. So nice quick change there. So once we get going, actually, we can sort of add these things in fairly quickly. Okay, so I'm just going to test that and then we can move on to the next bit. So I'm just going to enter the correct data here, 30 students, enter the number of candidates. So I'll enter 1 candidate, and actually it's saying, sorry, that's wrong. Number of candidates must be between 2 and 4. If I enter 8 candidates, again, that's incorrect. But if I enter 4, that's fine. That's in our range and we can move on. Okay, so now we have done that, we've done our 3 bits of data entry, we can move on to the next part. And the next part, it says here, allow the tutor to enter the names of the candidates and store them in a suitable data structure. So for this, actually what they're talking about is a data structure would be an array, a one-dimensional array. There is no other data structure that they're really looking for this IGCSE exam board. So we need to create an array that's going to store the candidate names. So let's do that. And we need to add that at the top of the code. We need to always try and add our variables and our arrays like this at the top. So I'm going to call it, cans. And I'm going to set it to be empty to start with, because we're going to populate it with the number of candidates in the election. So create your array at the top, and then down here, once we've entered the number of candidates in this section of code here, what we can do is when they've entered something valid here, we can then ask the user to enter the names of the candidates. So we can put out a message that says enter the candidate name. And what we can do is we can use a for loop actually. So actually, I'll just remove that for a moment. We're going to use a for loop. So we're going to, depending on however many candidates there are, we're going to loop that many times. So if there's 4 candidates, we're going to loop 4 times. If there's 2 candidates, we'll loop 2 times, etc. So what we're going to do is we're going to create our loop, and it's going to loop however many times there are candidates, like this. Remember that a for loop is a fixed loop, so that means it will run however many times you tell it to, and only that number of times. Then what we're going to do is we're going to print out a message to say enter candidate name. And remember, this is what we do each time we're entering them. Enter the candidate name. Now this time, actually, we need to enter the candidate name for the first candidate, then the second, third, or fourth. And we're going to use the index because the index counts where we are, but we need to do it +1 because remember that it starts at 0. Whenever a for loop runs, it starts at 0, and we don't want to print out 0. We don't want a candidate to be candidate 0. That's just a bit odd. And then what we're going to do is we're going to get the user to input the name of the candidate. Sorry, actually, we don't need a prompt there. Thinking about that, we don't need a prompt. We're just going to leave that. And then what we need to do is we need to add that candidate name to the candidate array that we created up here called cans. You could call it something else if you want. So we're going to do cans.append, and append adds it into the array. Like that. So we're going to add the name that they've just entered into the array. Now we do need to do one other thing here later on. We'll come back to that though. We'll just leave it like this for now. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to add in a little prompt to check that this is working correctly. I'm just going to, not a prompt, I'm just going to print out the array as we go along, just to show that it is adding people in. Okay. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to run module and enter in the data. Number of students in the class, 30. Number of candidates, so I have 4 candidates. Enter candidate name 1, so I'll add me in, and then Bob, Sarah, and Stephen. There we go, and it's finished. So we've got our array here. It's a bit clunky looking, but it's just debug, so we're just looking to see what's going on, and that is Julia, Bob, Sarah, Stephen are the 4 candidates. Okay, so now we can move on. Now we can start adding in the actual votes for people, and we'll do that in the next video.